Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. Today is April 25th, Saturday. We are going to be doing 10 years military terror in Indonesia. Essentially the last and climactical chapter about the American involvement in the overthrow of Sukarno. I want to just review the book. It's called 10 Years Military Terror in Indonesia, book by Malcolm Caldwell and a large number of scholars who put it together. Then the other books I have referenced for this presentation are Pretext for Mass Murder by Jonathan Rusa, the September 30th Movement and Suharto's coup d'etat in Indonesia. And the other book, Jakarta Method, Washington's anti-communist crusade and the mass murder program that shaped our world. So I hope you enjoyed our presentation. I'm going to just provide some background, and then we're going to read one chapter in the 10 Years Military Terror in Indonesia. The United States' smooth, sadistic, cruel, and detached racist butchers of Washington had a paradigm in mind following 7 years of intense research of the Indonesian military establishment. This research included many academic, American white anti-communist frauds and U.S. mass media anti-communist and colonial frauds being directed by the U.S. government, John Foster Dulles, Lyndon Johnson, Dwight Eisenhower, the State Department, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the CIA. The gradual project involved a slow, insidious, parasitic takeover of Indonesian profit-producing businesses, civilian and defense sectors by members of the Indonesian military elite establishment. Through the establishment of Indonesian military generals getting intricately involved in civilian circles and into high-profit companies in Indonesia, Washington was able to control the cash flow through the establishment, through the notorious military generals, Suharto, Yani, and Nasution. Over time, the CIA continued to study the economic model in Indonesia with an eye to having American companies take over the business cash flow through the military generals. They deliberately communicated with Sukarno under the pretext of providing economic and military aid and justified this aid to stay secretly in touch with the military generals for the correct moment to strike. Remember, President Koesno Sukarno was highly revered by his people and was the democratic ruler since 1949 when the country first gained independence from Dutch colonial rule. Sukarno also was very much pro-Indonesian, a patriot, and a loyal servant of his people. Other people similar to him include Mao Zedong of China and Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam. His model for progress was not a Western one. He was interested in several things. He wanted sovereignty over his natural resources, including oil, timber, rice, copra cakes, coffee, tobacco, palm oil, palm kernels, and pepper, as well as tea, hard fibers, and gas. He tried nationalizing the oil company Pertamina, similar to Mossadegh in Iran. His nationalist push was not viewed favorably in Washington. His strong base of support, the PKI, accounted for nearly 30 to 40% of the population of Indonesia. Such a base of support cannot be easily subverted. And the United States not only did not accept it was not right to overthrow the democratic and popular leader of Indonesia, Sukarno, but also wanted to exterminate the PKI and his support base. The smooth, white, racist butchers of Washington were extremely sadistic, detached, and cruel in their treatment of the Indonesian people. When a group of people represents 30 to 40% of the population and you have a plan to murder them, that is genocide and should be avoided at all cost. Washington openly confronted this wall of moral conscience by providing a military that was trained by the United States to be ruthless and willing to shed blood with no limits of bound. The smooth, sadistic white butchers of Washington were waiting when the military generals were discussing overthrow of Sukarno and being advised by the U.S. government. The deranged criminal psychopaths of Washington fed extensive genocidal hardware to the generals. They also secretly compiled lists of PKI members to be murdered by the generals and provided them to generals for extermination. They had PSI Mesjumi instigate student activists with propaganda that the communists were mutilating the military generals' genital organs, and there were witch-hunting PKI members murdering the people secretly in their houses. Recounts of electric chairs in PKI houses to kill people in Indonesia were fabricated in the Indonesian military press and propaganda, causing the most extensive bloodshed in Indonesia, and probably the worst form of human slaughter throughout the world, which is only comparable in terms of magnitude to that of Hitler. Beginning in the Eisenhower administration, a new strategy of combating the PKI was devised. Since the PKI were very nationalist and against colonialism and racist oppression by Washington, there was a sophisticated strategy employed by the National Security Council. The party was well organized, highly disciplined, and extremely popular. The NSC's assessment was that the PKI would probably have emerged the largest party in Indonesia if Sukarno had not canceled the election scheduled for 1959. The army could not simply attack the communists in pit bull fashion. Open measures of repression against the PKI would be difficult to justify on internal political grounds and would expose any government undertaking them of charges of truckling to Western pressure. The army would have to approach the PKI carefully. Any attack on the party would have to be justified in the very terms of Indonesian nationalism that the party itself championed. The trick was to frame the Communist Party into having taken a rash action that would make it appear anti-national. The NSC document of 1959 emphasized that the United States, in providing aid to the Indonesian army, should prioritize requests for assistance on programs and projects which offer opportunities to isolate the PKI, drive it into positions of open opposition of the Indonesian government and military establishment, and thereby create the grounds for repressive measures politically justifiable in terms of Indonesian national self-interest. The consistent U.S. strategy from 1959 to 1965 was to help the army officers prepare themselves for a violent attack upon the PKI. Howard Jones, the ambassador to Jakarta for 7 years from 1958 to 1965, and one of the main architects of the policy, supplied an important element of continuity for the administration. In accordance with this policy, the U.S. government trained Indonesian military officers in the United States, donated and sold weapons secretly to the military without knowledge of Sukarno, and provided abundant financial aid to General Nasution, the commander of the army, who was America's golden boy, and his firm commitment to be a stooge of the Western colonial powers had convinced the smooth butchers of Washington that the army was the best hope for containing the Communist Party. The U.S. justified aid to the Indonesian army in 1958 and encouraged Nasution to carry out his plan for Washington colonial sovereignty over Indonesia. After Sukarno shunted Nasution aside in June 1962, promoting him to administrative position as chief of the armed forces and removing him from the troop command, Lieutenant General Ahmad Yani continued the same position as representatives of the colonial Washington regime. The United States spent $10 to $20 million and intensively trained the Indonesian officers in such schools in the U.S., such as Fort Bragg and Fort Leavenworth. 2,800 Army Indonesian officers were brought to the United States for training, most of them after 1958. That is about 1/4 of the Indonesian total armed forces. The U.S. developed thus secretive contacts with the Indonesian army. Most of the officers thus trained were behind Washington's interest in openly colonizing Indonesia. Dean Rusk wrote to President Johsnon in 1964 essentially that the aid we are giving the generals is permitting us good contact with the key elements in Indonesia that will allow us to complete the colonization process. There was also a big civic action campaign by the U.S. government. The US government used the military on projects useful to the local population and was intended to involve the army generals in activities normally reserved for civilians. Soldiers were to become officials within the civilian governments, such as village heads, and work on infrastructure and long-term plans for future colonial rule. The National Security Council endorsed the idea of strengthening the Indonesian army's military role and economic and social developer in Indonesia. The Indonesian Army's newly christened Civic Action Program was under the control of Colonel George Benson, whose official title from August 1962 to July 1965 was Special Assistant to the U.S. Ambassador for Civic Action. Benson enjoyed full and open access to all secretive Indonesian military participation in civic action and was good friends with Ahmad Yani. Benson knew Yani previously as U.S. military attaché at the Jakarta Embassy in 1956 to 1959, and so was allowed to work freely in Indonesia as a member of the colonial U.S. government to essentially dismember the democracy of Indonesia secretly. NSA committee documents that are declassified reports that money would be given, quote, to support civic action and anti-Indonesian nationalist activities that would involve the covert training of selected personnel and civilians who will be placed in key positions in the, and then the words were censored, Civic Action Program. The many excised passages in the declassified NSC document is an open admission of guilt by the smooth white racist butchers of Washington to conduct a state within a state in Indonesia, in which the democracy is controlled by Sukarno, but the economy and military are controlled by Washington. Further, they contested strategic sites in civil society prior to launching their attack on state power. The army had Golkar Functional Group, which was the only political party, and a splinter union faction, Koesno, Central Organization of Socialist Employees in Indonesia, an extremist group that sees unemployment as a result of too many people rather than too few jobs, for which the solution is genocide. Newspapers such as Angkatan Bersenjata were controlled by the army. A group of cultural figures who worked closely with anti-communist officers were also included. By sprouting the broad and extensive subversion of military organizations through the entrenched military dictatorship under the guise of the smooth white butchers of Washington, the army was transforming itself into a state within a state. The army was then slowly able to become involved in civilian politics. Martial law was introduced often and was to become the Army's political charter. The regional army commanders restricted the press, arrested politicians arbitrarily, and imposed their own unwritten laws. The nationalization of Dutch businesses in 1957 by Sukarno allowed the army an opportunity to enter the economy. Many army commanders became wealthy businessmen, turning handsome profits from plantations, factories, import and export ventures, and illegal smuggling. They accumulated sizable funds to bankroll their efforts to invade strategic areas of the civil society of Indonesia, all while Sukarno was president. General Nasution even pushed for a corporatist military state in the early 1960s, in which political parties would be abolished and the public sphere evacuated of political contestation. In 1958, veteran politicians Jahir warned that Nasution's army's general officers harbored a militaristic and fascist ideal of the Indonesian government. The U.S. government felt that the Asian governments could be better controlled by fascist military dictatorships, which could allow for chattel slavery of the people and starvation, famine, and genocide as benefits of their colonial rule. The military, they felt, had the best interests of the people in mind. Political academic white fraud, Dr. Lucian Pai, of the MIT academic nexus of quacks, suggested that armies in developing countries could be modernizing agents, since they tend to emphasize a rational, quote unquote, outlook and, quote unquote, champion responsible change and national development through genocide, famine, chattel slavery, and rampant prostitution. He further added that Army's officers appreciated technological advancement, quote unquote, and could promote a, quote unquote, sense of citizenship and were capable of strengthening essential administrative functions. So let us assess Dr. Pai's interest in military rule in Indonesia from what happened after the military dictatorship was put in place in 1965. The rational outlook of murdering all PKI members in order to stop dissent, to me, does not promote a rational outlook or responsible change for nationalist development. Their interest in technological advancement includes murder through genocidal technology and gun violence resolution of disputes, again, not promoting a sense of citizenship among the people, nor strengthening essential administrative functions. Walt Ristow headed a team at the State Department and wrote a paper, The Role of the Military in Underdeveloped Countries, that endorsed disregarding civilian supremacy in favor of military supremacy. The state, he recommended, should be controlled by the military and there should be no input from the people. But Guy Parker, who was affiliated with Rand Corporation and University of California at Berkeley, noticed that Nasution was following a clever long-term strategy in making the Indonesian army into an organization that would support American colonial rule. Nasution was waiting until the army was tightly knit and entrenched itself throughout the civilian sector as well as the economy. Parker reiterated that the army was the only hope for American colonial rule in Indonesia. Parker struck up a relationship with the Army Staff College Vice Director, Colonel Suharto, who was grooming his fellow officers for their future role as leaders. He was a personal enemy of Sukarno and was graduated from the 1959 U.S. military training program at Fort Leavenworth. Suharto and the Army generals tried to work in a subtle fashion. They arranged for U.S. trained economists at the University of Indonesia to come to Bandung and teach seminars for the officers. These economists had received special training in the academic nexus of frauds of the United States University of California at Berkeley, funded by the Ford Foundation. Berkeley professor Bruce Glassburner spent 3 years in Indonesia, 1958 to 1961, and later recalled that the army officers at CESCODE wanted to learn about economics so that they could control the Indonesian economy. They were ultimately in pursuit of state power and greedy agents of the smooth white butchers of Washington. The economists of Indonesian origin who taught at CESCODE, such as Muhammad Sadli, later become the so-called technocrats and Berkeley mafia of the Suharto regime. Suharto was a criminal who was charged with corruption and dismissed from the army for smuggling as an army commander. The charges were hushed up and he was sent to CESCODE in late 1959. There he met Suharto. He was involved in the formation of the doctrine of territorial warfare and the penetration of army officers into all fields of government activities, businesses, and civilian offices. As the leader of this colonial shadow government in Indonesia, he became very friendly with the United States politicians. Confrontasi was a border skirmish between Sukarno and the British colonial government of independent Malaya. Although independent, Malaya was infiltrated by British special agents and intelligence who destroyed the leftist movement and maintained a right-wing military dictatorship advised by Britain. As we alluded to previously, Sukarno became acutely aware of British trickery in Malaysia and was not happy with the violent suppression of leftists in that country. He made this clear and began border skirmishes. The army generals did not like this. They were not interested in conflict with Britain or with the United States, as they were seeking to maintain Indonesia as a colonial American state. Thus, any orders Sukarno gave to the army were secretly discarded by Yani, Nasution, and Suharto, making Sukarno stand a failure at the border. This clearly indicates that the smooth white butchers of Washington and the army generals were totally devoid of any democratic thought and entrenched in recolonizing Indonesia for American capitalist interests. Suharto and the army generals went so far as to directly communicate with the enemy, Britain and the United States, despite being the Indonesian military. This clearly indicates a complete lack of respect for the popularly elected leader Sukarno and complete sedition on the part of the army officers involved in not executing the wishes of the duly democratically elected President Sukarno. Finally, it is very clear that the coup was finally arranged as a direct result of CIA covert actions to paint the PKI as anti-nationalist and a danger to the security of Indonesia. Transcripts of conversations between Johnston, McNamara, CIA, Senate Foreign Intelligence Committee, State Department, and the Indonesian military generals point to the CIA planting the seed for the overthrow of Sukarno. They forced the PKI into a position of fear through the army generals. The events around September 30th movement clearly reveal the recorded transcripts of conversations between Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the State Department, and the CIA, and reveal that an event was needed in Indonesia that would be viewed by the public as an anti-nationalist event, that would be a threat to security and justify severe repressive measures against 30 to 40% of the population who were members of the PKI. The CIA made this event happen through the September 30th movement. The transcripts further propose that it is anticipated that an attack and murder on the army generals by the PKI was to occur in a short time. These transcripts clearly reveal that the smooth white butchers of Washington intend to spark off the coup by utilizing covert action through sham, Colonel Untung, Legtif, Suparjo, etc., which involved Suharto and the army generals. And then once the Sukarno loyalist officers were in a vulnerable position, violently attacked the loyalists and set off the worst bloodbath in the history of mankind. Over 1.5 million people were slaughtered by the army generals in 6 months, and severe repression, including arbitrary imprisonment, chattel slavery, sexual slavery, disappearances, mass graves, mass starvation and famine, indescribable homelessness, and colonial high crimes were committed by the smooth Washington racist white butchers throughout the military. The bloodbath is described as the worst organized slaughter in world history and is comparable only to Hitler's extermination of the Jews and blacks in Nazi Germany. Thus, in summary, the white smooth butchers of Washington, led by the Johnson administration, the CIA, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and U.S. military and American academic white frauds and U.S. mass media all conspired against populist leader Sukarno in the most murderous assault against a group of human beings the world has yet to see. The 32-year military dictatorship of Haj Suharto was kept secret from the world and resulted in the worst economic failure of American capitalism evident in any colonial country. The American colonial rule did result in one thing. It made the smooth Washington white butchers and their capitalists richer, starved the Indonesian people, forced millions of Indonesians into concentration camps and homelessness, and resulted in an economic debt by the Indonesian government well greater than any benefit it had ever received from this colonial capitalist paradigm. The dictatorship finally ended in 1998, 50 years after the last colonial government was dissolved. This whole history is kept secret by the smooth white sadistic detached cruel butchers of Washington. So we're going to go through that chapter. The name of the chapter is Exporting Military Economic Development, America and the Overthrow of Sukarno, 1965 to 1967. The bloody suppression of the Indonesian left in 1965 marks a new phase in the history of modern counter-revolution, the resort to mass extermination in an attempt to consolidate authoritarian power. An estimated 500,000 or more PKI supporters were killed in this period, creating a gruesome precedent for the slaughter that accompanied the Cambodian coup of 1970 and the Chilean coup of 1973. Despite, or perhaps because of the enormity of the Indonesian crime, there has been particular silence about it in the American press, making it more than usually difficult to assess the degree of Western involvement in Sukarno's overthrow. The pages which follow are addressed in redressing this silence. I shall argue that American policymakers knew in advance about planning for the military takeover, facilitated it, took credit for it when it occurred, and even publicly exhorted the military to displace Sukarno in quasi-official U.S. publications. The CIA, as has recently been noted, played a role in General Suharto's counter-coup of 1965. But the American preparations for a military takeover in Indonesia were too large and too public to be confined to one U.S. agency. They involved not only the U.S. Army and oil companies, traditional meddlers in other nations' affairs, but the Ford Foundation, Harvard, the Council of Foreign Relations, and in short, the insiders at the very apex of the traditional U.S. political and intellectual establishment. At the heart of this planning was a new strategic concept of military economic development, as articulated for RAND and the Council of Foreign Relations after mid-1958 by CIA military officers and new mandarins like Edward Lansdale and Guy Parker. These men argued that the officer corps of underdeveloped countries in general, and Indonesian particularly, constituted a naturally selected and morally superior elite. The only viable alternative to communist takeover should therefore be given constructive assistance in preparation for direct responsibility over the economic development of their nation. In my view, this doctrine, which some may have sincerely believed, looks after 2 decades of American clumsy brutalities in Southeast Asia to have been murderous and deceptive nonsense, a cloak for quite different realities. But whatever one's viewpoint, what stands out is that the doctrine was implemented in Indonesia and could not have been without sustained American support. A word of disclaimer: I am in no way an Indonesian scholar. Even my writings about Vietnam War are not based on direct experience of that country. But it is as true of Indonesian today as of Vietnam in the days of deemed so-called quote-unquote economic miracle. The version of history prevailing in American journals is widely at variance with the alternative versions from Asian and European scholars, which are virtually inaccessible to the USA. Frequently, it takes no scholar to see that the official quote-unquote version, American version, is suspect, if not indeed deliberately misleading. Those politicians who plotted against Sukarno's government, the PSI and Masyumi parties, are repeatedly called moderates, while those who supported it are called unreliable or worse. The claim that the PKI inspired the untung coup of September 1965, which in the words of one anti-communist student activist, provided the long-awaited legitimization for the determined assault against the extreme and unprepared left, is a claim supported by captured documents and, above all, the so-called quote-unquote aided confession, a document quoted even by those who virtually admit it to be a forgery. The ensuing anti-PKI riots are said to have been spontaneous, quote unquote, and to have caught all leaders unprepared, quote unquote, in their vehemence, even though the same student source has concealed they were well organized by the pro-Masyumi student groups with substantial support from certain sectors of the military leadership, along with outside, quote unquote, financial aid. Such familiar anomalies among American reports confirm the impression that, in Indonesia's coup, as in Vietnam's successive coups, the first key to understanding is an expertise in the ways not of Asia, but of the United States. The CIA in Indonesia before 1959. In foreign policy, nations learn most from their failures. Nothing distorts perception as much as success. America's massive interventions in Southeast Asia were inspired in large part by the 1940 success of the CIA and Marshall Plan, ECA officials, in denying communism electoral victories in Western Europe. From 1948 to 1951, there were so many CIA officers in ECA missions that the latter are sometimes viewed as little more than a CIA cover. This view is misleading. ECA was drawn from and represented not just one agency, but a governing political establishment of insiders, quote unquote. Along with oilsman Paul Regorsky, editors Roscoe Drummond, later of Freedom House, and future CIA officials Glenn Morehouse, Richard Bissell of the Bay of Pigs, and Howard Hunt. ECA's mission were also staffed with future careerists in public relations, Robert Mullen of the CIA-linked Mullen Agency, Hunt's employer in the Watergate affair, Congressman Henry Roos, universities, future Yale president Kingsman Brewster, an intelligence veteran, and the planning of the Vietnam War, future Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, John T. McNaughton. After 1951, a whole cadre of ECA officials migrated with Paul Hoffman to the newly created Ford Foundation. And as David Ransom has shown, some of these men could be very active in Indonesia. Here, the possibilities for U.S. cooperation must have seemed especially promising. Indonesia owned its independence in large part to the pressures exerted upon Holland by ECA officials in late 1948. The country's great resources of oil and rubber seemed ideally to complement the developed economies of the United States and her new Asian partner, Japan. Politically, however, the United States faced the same problem as in Indochina. The legacy of colonialism was a chaotically disorganized social structure in which, by the late 1950s, only the Communist Party seemed strong enough eventually to unify the country. American officials, having got away with tilting the electoral process against Soviet influence in Europe, proceeded to the much more ambitious tactic of stopping communism, quote unquote, in Asia, even where this clearly meant excluding the communists from elections altogether. The CIA, accordingly, was active in Indonesia after 1950, following the aid visit of ECA official R. Allen Griffin, an Army intelligence veteran and later a trustee of the CIA's Asia Foundation. The resulting STEM, or Special Technical and Economic Mission, that sent CIA officials to Indochina in 1951, headed by Robert Blum, later president of the Asia Foundation, was paralleled by a second STEM to Indonesia, headed by veteran U.S. intelligence officer Shannon McCune. Meanwhile, Sukarno has already followed the example of so many other anti-communist strongmen, quote unquote. The world has and obtained the services of a freewheeling political fixer in Washington, quote unquote. This was U.S. movie industry representative Matthew Fox, who some years later would figure, along with satirist, quote, Sonny Fasoulas, a similar fixer for Chiang Kai-shek, in the major stock scandals of Alexander Guterma and his business colleagues in organized crime. Rather like race-tracking mogul Tom Pappas with the Greek kernels, Matthew Fox arranged a generous loan to Indonesia in exchange for special business privileges there. Again, like Tom Pappas, this meant that in practice, Matthew Fox worked directly with, if not for, the CIA. His Indonesian counterpart was Sumitro Jojo Hadikusumo, Jakarta's 1947 to 1948 trade minister and representative in the U.S. and the CIA's favorite moderate during and after the 1958 rebellion. Matthew Fox lobbied publicly in the successful political campaign to use ECA pressures to extricate the Dutch from Indonesia. By the mid-1950s, the CIA was spending millions to subsidize Sumitro's Socialist Party, the PSI, and its much larger Muslim ally, the Masyumi Party. In 1957, when Sukarno moved to nationalize the Shell and other Dutch interests and threatened to expropriate American interests as well, the CIA's experts in covert warfare responded, organizing what was probably the CIA's most ambitious paramilitary exercise before the Bay of Pigs. Having arranged for Sumitro's escape from corruption charges to Sumatra by airplane. The CIA followed up with bombing missions and logistic support for the ill-fated rebellion of 1958 in the outer islands of Sumatra and Sulawesi, whose civilian leaders were the CIA-funded PSI and Masjumi politicians. The B-26s and pilots for these bombing missions were supplied by Civil Air Transport, the CIA proprietary, which had already been actively involved in Thailand, Vietnam, Tibet, and even the KMT opium operations in Burma. Other U.S. support for the 1958 coup included American and Filipino advisors to the insurgents, the dispatch of an attack aircraft carrier group to Sumatran waters, and an issuance of published comments by Dulles on Sukarno's trends towards communism and warnings about threats to U.S. property at the Caltex oil fields. However, a determined move by Indonesian paratroops on March 12, 1958, coupled with the simultaneous failure of the SEATO Council of Foreign Ministers to agree on an Indonesian policy, forestalled an American naval attack at that time. Later, a Sukarno Mobile spokesman, William Henderson, in arguing for American backing of anti-communists in the face of all likely communist challenges, including a successful communist coup d'etat or victory at the polls, would complain that U.S. intervention in Indonesia in and after 1958 had been merely covert, half-hearted, and on the whole, rather absurd. America's historic tasks, he argued in 1963, demand a degree of involvement in the affairs of Southeast Asia that few possibly could have imagined even a decade ago. What followed in Indonesia, as in Korea, was a shift of U.S. interest from civilians with links to the West and or nationalist China to local military forces trained in many instances by the Japanese. So you can see the smooth white racist butchers of Washington, the sadistic, cruel, and detached genocidal butchers of Washington set the stage for totally undermining democracy in Indonesia and mass murdering the people, committing a genocide against the people. He has, directly and properly indicated sources that show that the United States government was completely entrenched in their military takeover in Indonesia, effectively a colonial military takeover by the United States government of President Sukarno and the sovereign, democratically elected and populist regime there. What followed, it is important to see the CIA support for the 1958 Sumatran insurgency as no isolated incident, but as part of an increasingly militarized area of CIA paramilitary operations that began in Greece in the late 1940s and climaxed with the Bay of Pigs fiasco of 1961. Symbolic of this continuity was the movement of troubleshooters like the State Department's Jack Purified from Greece in 1950, where he was said to have put Premier Papagos in power, to Guatemala in 1954, where he played the key role in ousting Arbenz, to Thailand in 1957, or to Whiting Willower of the Civil Air Transport, which he helped found in 1946, to Honduras in 1953, the base air operations against Arbenz, to the role of the State Department coordinator for the Bay of Pigs in 1960. Chinese pilots recruited through Civil Air Transport helped to bomb the Guatemalan capital of 1954 and to train Cuban pilots for the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Some of these Cubans flew later in the Congo, just as Cuban U.S. Special Forces, originally trained by Lansdale's Philippine assistants, Napoleon de Villarino, are said to be operating in the Philippines. The humiliating exposure of the Bay of Pigs operation following upon Sukarno's capture in 1958 of an American cat pilot in Sumatra led, at least in theory, to the establishment in the 1960s of stricter limits on CIA special operations. Henceforth, except in Indochina, the CIA would have no more B-26s at its disposal. Its operations must again be, in the words of the original secret charter, secret or plausibly deniable. Any operation involving more than handguns had to involve a more bureaucratic, less flexible Pentagon via the newly created Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA. This change in CIA background ground rules severely limited the CIA's option in response to the rapidly growing strength of the Communist Party of Indonesia. As we shall see, American planners took the challenge on a broader, not a more restricted scale. The Vietnam War and the overthrow of Sukarno. By 1964, it was increasingly clear that the crucial political issue in Indonesia was no longer Sukarno himself, but the polarization of his base into competing factions of right and left, the army under General Nasution and the PKI. As the Far Eastern Economic Review noted, President Sukarno holds the balance of power, but not power itself. Most observers agree that the U.S. escalation in Vietnam from 1964 to 1966 had at least the effect of hastening the polarization of Indonesian politics. Robert Chaplin, a writer who frequently uses CIA sources, has written that the U.S. buildup forced the pro-communist elements in the Indonesian army to stage their abortive coup of September 1965 before they were fully organized. Much more interesting is the occurrence of Lyndon Johnson, that the Indonesian turnaround would probably never have occurred if the United States and others had not taken a stand in Vietnam. Richard Nixon wrote in October 1967 issue of the CFR journal Foreign Affairs that the U.S. stand in Vietnam was the vital factor in the turnaround in Indonesia. It provided a shield behind which the anti-communist forces found the courage and the capacity to stage their counter-coup, emphasis added. Nixon's carefully chosen words echoed those uttered by government spokesmen like William Bundy, and also a 1966 pro-war advertisement signed by numerous CFR regulators and CIA allies such as John Richardson Jr., head of the Radio Free Europe, and Thomas Cabot, involved in the CIA's Guatemala and Bay of Pigs operations. The American military presence in Vietnam provided a shield for the sharp reversal of Indonesia's shift towards communism. General Maxwell Taylor and ex-President Eisenhower also gave America credit for the success of the Indonesian counter-coup, even after the murderous features of that operation had been amply publicized. Of course, this fact does not prove American foreknowledge that the Indonesian counter-coup would follow upon U.S. escalation in South Vietnam. But it is equally obvious that the U.S. escalations of 1965 were publicly justified by President Johsnon on April 7, 1965, as a struggle for all Southeast Asia and as the basis for regional economic development. In his words just before the Indonesian coup, Mr. Johnston stated, "There are great stakes in the balance. Most of the non-communist nations of Asia cannot by themselves and alone resist growing might and the grasping ambition of Asian communism. Our power, therefore, is a very vital shield." The word shield, which recurs in these quotations, is taken from the military economic strategic thinking which underlay NATO and the Marshall Plan, ECA, in Europe in the late 1940s, and which CFR and the Asia Society brain trusters were now pushing inside and outside the U.S. government bureaucracy for application in Asia. In official theory, a shield for economic development had already been supplied in 1954 by SEATO, but in practice, it was conceded that SEATO never fulfilled this objective, not just because only 3 non-contiguous Asian countries signed it, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan, but because from the outset, SEATO had lacked both the political unity and military strength. The NATO analogy was officially revived in 1965 by Johnson's double announcement on April 7th of a major military commitment and a program for regional economic development. The U.S. military economic strategic planning of 1965 applied to the whole region of Southeast Asia, and it would be wrong to try to explain it by the crisis of Indonesia in particular. As I have written elsewhere, overt mentions of Indonesia in the published Pentagon papers become significantly scarcer after 1961, as do economic arguments generally. But public advocates of escalation in early 1965, such as Lodge, who had been called back into the government as a special consultant, quote unquote, did not hesitate to point out to the resources of Indonesia Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries as the justification. Over and over, the American people were told that the real issue was communist China, which must be persuaded to stay out of Southeast Asia. This combination of U.S. military and anti-Chinese propaganda, which gradually diminished in the 1966 to 1967 as the Indonesian situation stabilized, clearly was, in Richard Nixon's words, a vital factor affecting the behavior of all the parties in the Indonesian crisis of 1965 October. Absentee nation building, the Council of Foreign Relations blueprint. Other clues suggest that this impact of U.S. policy on the Indonesian counter-coup was not fortuitous, but well considered. The first is the extent to which the counter-coup fulfilled a blueprint for U.S. policy which had been drawn up by Professor Russell Fifield of University of Michigan and published a few years earlier by the influential Council on Foreign Relations in New York. This blueprint, in turn, grew out of 1955 to 1960 CFR study group on Southeast Asia in U.S. policy, whose members included representatives of all the elements who would later turn theory into practice. These included bankers such as M. Morton Murphy and John Rockefeller III, oil company employees, Kenneth Todd Young and aforementioned William Henderson, area specialists Paul Linebarger and George Cahin, regular and CIA-linked military, ex-CIA Colonel William Kinter, Rand Corporation personnel Alan Whiting, CIA-linked public relations man Robert Nathan, a planning consultant and former lobbyist for Indonesia, State Department personnel William Maddox, former OSS liaison with British intelligence, economists, new mandarins of policy planning, including Frank Traeger, and men working directly for CIA, notably Admiral Felix Stump, USN, retired board chairman of Air America. Only some of these men, and they were all men, were administrators of U.S. policy. But like the CFR itself, nearly all of them, when acting together, fulfilled a higher function as integrators of U.S. policy formation. The prophetic quality of the blueprint and as at times breathtaking, asserting that Sumitra Joja Dikusumo and other PRRI leaders of the short-lived 1958 revolt were among the most capable leaders of Indonesia. Professor Fifield of University of Michigan continued, with the military decline of the PRRI, apart from guerrilla warfare, Washington clearly decided it was best to provide assistance to President Sukarno, but at the same time to build up non-communist and anti-communist forces, especially those represented by General Nasution, the nationalist army elite, and certain other leaders. Ambassador Howard Jones came to personify the new course of action. In Indonesia's future, the key men of the PRRI cannot be overlooked, if only because of their rare qualities of leadership. In 1959, the most outstanding of these rare qualities were their recently demonstrated willingness to plot treasonously with the CIA against a popularly elected and democratically supported government. Despite or perhaps of these rare qualities, Sumitra and the PSI Matsumi PRRI allies are usually described in America as quote-unquote moderates. As David Ransom has written, only a miracle could have restored these men to power. Yet the CFR's unabashed prescription for another country's government was fulfilled in 1968, when Suharto made Sumitra his Minister of Trade and Commerce, and Sumitra's protege, Wildajo Nitasastro, chairman of the National Planning Board. These men and others of their circle were particularly close to Guy Parker of the Rand Corporation, who collaborated in the CFR Fifield publication project. In addition, Sumitra was close to Professor George Cahin of the Ford Foundation's Modern Indonesia project at Cornell, who also participated in the CFR Fifield Southeast Asia operation. Cahin later emerged as a leading dissenter from U.S. Vietnam policy, Parker as a leading defender of it. The post-1965 coup Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which American mandarins like Bernard Gordon had pushed through the Army's Research Analysis Corporation as a strategic counterpart to NATO, is an idea which, in Gordon's version of history, can be traced primarily to the new Indonesian government, in particular to Foreign Minister Adam Malik. Unfortunately, for Professor Gordon's credibility, the detailed prescription for ASEAN, including the same name and acronym, was published by his colleagues Russell Fifield under the CFR auspices in 1963. So you can see, he says very clearly that, in 1959, the most of these rare qualities was their recently demonstrated willingness of the generals, the military generals, to plot treasonously with the CIA against a popularly elected and democratically supported government. So he is, criticizing the military generals as treasonous and plotting with, the U.S. government, the CIA, and the white smooth butchers of Washington against the people's will in Indonesia, which resulted in genocide, famine, economic catastrophe, misery, starvation, and mass murder. That is the U.S. government, white smooth butchers of Washington. The most important of the CFR policy recommendations, however, were its prescriptions not for the Indonesian government, but for the United States. Perhaps the most important of these was one which, as we shall see, turned out in practice to be a good deal less innocuous than it sounded. Military training is a particularly significant aspect of U.S. aid in Southeast Asia. The development of skills necessary for this use and maintenance of American arms and equipment has a potential for developing badly needed technical and administrative talents. The military forces Southeast Asia can also be used with American technical aid in advancing economic development by opening new lands for settlement, building roads, bridges, and waterways. As so often in the case of CFR and Rockefeller-sponsored projects, the CFR study group of 1959 to 1960 blended into a larger flow of interlocking policymaking by insiders or integrators, both in and out of the government. In this case, Fifield's language endorsed similar recommendations in 1959 for integrated military economic development and training from a Rockefeller Brothers special study project, and earlier from a presidential committee chaired by former ESA Ambassador William Draper Jr. to study the U.S. military assistance program. The Draper report, in turn, echoed the recommendations submitted earlier in one of its annexes by the CIA-subsidized Foreign Policy Research Institute, with the advice of Guy Parker, who was on the CIA payroll. The FPRI annex spoke openly of encouraging new military elites composed of some of the finest human material to assume greater responsibility for economic progress. At least three people, ex-CIA Colonel William Kinter of the FPRI, Colonel Amos Jordan Charles Wolfe Jr., collaborated on all three projects of policy integration, the CFR, Rockefeller, and Draper projects. President Kennedy, whose interregnum task force on foreign economic affairs was drawn almost uniquely from OSS, CIA, and ECA veterans, proclaimed in his first foreign aid message that military assistance will in the future more heavily emphasize the military security, civil works, and economic growth of the nations thus aided. The result in Indonesia was that the Pentagon expanded both its regular training and its civic action aid programs, building bridges and roads and so on, until when the crunch came, 1/3 of the Indonesian general staff had some sort of training from Americans, and almost half of the officer corps. Parker, a close friend of Sumitro, with Jojo and Sadly, and a collaborator on the CFR Fifield project, had visited Indonesia 4 times since his first Ford Foundation MIT field project in 1954. Ford was then heavily staffed by ECA veterans, and MIT Center for International Studies, which organized the field project, was both secretly funded by CIA and headed by a CIA veteran and former ECA lobbyist, Max Milliken. As such, Parker had developed excellent military contacts among the anti-communist military. Simultaneously, he was able to advise the U.S. Congress in the so-called Conlon Report of 1959 to help provide them with the administrative and managerial skills. And as chairman from 1959 to 1963 of Berkeley's new Center for South and Southeast Asian Studies, Parker helped train the so-called Berkeley Mafia of Sumitro's disciples, some of whom became teachers at the Indonesian Army Command School, CESCODE. Parker's activities help explain why General Nasution, the Army Command School, and today the entire Indonesian Army hold a remarkably similar conception of the Army's military economic dual function, duifungsi. The armies to be most effective must become involved in all sectors of the society. It would have both a civil and military function. Duifungsi begun to be implemented in 1957 after Nasution persuaded Sukarno to impose martial law, and the army began supervising operations in the vast networks of firms taken over from the Dutch. As such, it represented a vast expansion of the dual-purpose civic action units developed in the Philippines by the CIA's Edward Lansdale and recommended for wider imitation on the basis of a special Lansdale memorandum by the Draper Report. Oil, the CFR, and the CIA. Civic action was first favored by Nasution for the same counterinsurgency political reasons as Lansdale, as an attempt by the army to compete with the PKI at the grassroots level. After 1957, the army was involved in all levels in managing the foreign-oriented segment of the economy, and above all, oil. Just as retired Indonesian officer Julius Tahija became a top Caltex official and remained in close contact with right-wing generals like Intelligence Chief Parman, so the army itself moved to the direct operation of politically troubled oil fields, starting with the former Royal Dutch Shell assets and Pankel and Brandon. In 1957, at General Nastian's instigation, this ad hoc arrangement was formalized. The army was granted its own oil company, Pertamina, headed by Nasution's deputy and close associate, Colonel Dr. Ibnu Sutowo. In 1960, reflecting the shaky balance of power of the new Manipul-guided democracy, 3 oil companies were recognized: PT Pertamina for the army, PN Permigan for the PKI, and Pertamin for the increasingly paralyzed government. By this arrangement, a 3-way struggle for political power, which the anti-communists seemed fated to lose, was particularly translated into a 3-way struggle for oil power in which they had a much better advantage. Ibnu Sutowo won the latter contest with the end of military bureaucratic cadres trained at Fort Benning, Fort Benjamin Harrison, Tulsa University, and the Business Ad School of Syracuse, whose Dean Harlan Cleveland was chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations 5-Field Study Group and a participant in the Rockefeller Special Study Project. We shall see that Ibnu Sutowo and Pertamina played a vital role in financing the political turnaround as well. Later, Secretary McNamara confirmed in a Senate debate that military aid had paid foreseen political dividends. The conventional portrayal of a pluralist United States, as taught by American political scientists, does not see its foreign policy as the application of high-level integrated blueprints, but rather as the unforeseeable result of interacting pressures from competing interest groups. In the case of Indonesia, it has been objected that training for development was just that, and not part of a larger political strategy of intervention. We shall see in a moment that at least some of America's small cadre of Indonesian development experts in the field, supported by Ford and or the Rand Corporation, argued in quasi-official publications that the goal of U.S. aid and training in Indonesia should be military takeover, even at the price of ruthlessness. This is where George T. Cahin, who stuck to education, can be distinguished from Guy Parker, an outspoken interventionist. In a more general way, it can be argued that the convergence of government Foundation and corporate personnel in a CFR study group is no proof by itself that the institutions represented will agree on a common political approach in practice. On the contrary, as Roger Hilsman has reminded us, managers from the parent companies of Caltex and Stanvac initially resisted the terms of a politically fruitful agreement with Ibn Sutowo in 1963 as worked out and to some extent imposed by U.S. State Department representatives. The resistance is instructive. It reminds us that corporate bureaucracies, like their government counterparts, tend to become irrationally committed to non-viable status quos. But the same episode, which resulted in agreement and working relationships with pertamina, Stanvac, and U.S. officials, illustrates very well the extent to which U.S. policy, at least in Indonesia, was worked out not by competing lower-level bureaucracies, but by an integrated higher-level elite with strong ECA and CFR links. The key figures in the 1963 solution were presidential representatives Wilson Wyatt, a politician who in the war years with the OSS linked Board of Economic Warfare and his special mission of 4 advisors. Of these 3, Ambassador to Indonesia Howard Jones, Michael Forrestal, and Walter Livy were veterans of the ECA in Europe, 1945-8 to 1951, while the key figures in Washington were Averell Harriman, ECA Ambassador to Europe in 1948 to 1950, and Roger Hilsman, ex-OSS and CIA. The career of the German-born Walter Levy is particularly interesting. A former chief of the OSS's petroleum section in 1942 to 1955 and ECA's oil branch 1948 to 1949 had served on Harriman's staff when the latter was Truman's representative to Iran in the oil dispute of 1951. And he later participated in the Rockefeller Brothers Blueprint Project. In 1963, Levy, a former economic advisor to Sukarno Vacuum and a long-term consultant to Esso, Caltex, and Shell, now served as advisor to the Indonesian delegation, securing their agreement to formulate for a 60-40 profit split that left the oil companies delighted. In 1968, Levy would help draft an oil investment law, or Thailand, which would be used later in South Vietnam. So I'm going to just step out for 1 second. I'll be right back, and we'll continue reading. Got a lot of stuff to go over, so I'll be right back. Okay, so we're just going to continue. The existence of a locus for highly centralized decision-making does not resolve all conflicts. On the contrary, Hilsman records that Kennedy's program of aiding Sukarno continued to be controversial, and that an $11 million package approved on November 19, 1963, was allowed to lapse in change of direction after the president's death 3 days later. But the same highly centralized locus rendered meaningful the process of absentee nation building conducted in CFR conference rooms. The CFR itself played a role in coordinating informally the various branches of the U.S. establishment, military, corporate, intelligence, academic, which in 1964 to 1965 sought to impose the U.S. regional design of military economic development upon Southeast Asia. Among the members of the 1959 to 1960 CFR study group were 3 with especially important contacts. One was State Department official William Maddox, the OSS veteran who from 1959 to 1963 was U.S. Consul General at Singapore, then the base of Sumitro and other PRRI exiles from Indonesia. The three others were First National Citibank's Vice President Alexander D. Calhoun, Asia Society, Far East American Council of Commerce and Industry, Sukarno's International Affairs Advisor, William Henderson, a former CFR employee, and above all, Kenneth Todd Young. As I have written elsewhere, Young's state directors of Southeast Asian affairs from 1954 to 1958 later became Kennedy's ambassador to Thailand and then coordinated Johnson's proposal for Southeast Asia regional economic development. But in 1959 to 1960, Young was listed as an employee of Stanvac, the Jersey Standard Sukarno Far Eastern subsidy, which after a 1960 court order functioned only in Indonesian intelligence veteran. Young visited Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon in October 1960, apparently on an intelligence mission, and his ensuing report to Washington of Vietnam's crisis of confidence formulated for the first time the psychological issue of confidence, which was explicitly addressed by Johnson's escalation speech of April 7, 1965. There is perhaps no final answer to the question whether, especially in Southeast Asia, it is the oil companies which further the projects of the CIA or whether it is the other way around. There is no doubt, however, the close collaboration between the two, particularly in the Far East. Banks and oil companies got into the international intelligence and coup management game long before there was ever a CIA. Indeed, the OSS, which preceded the CIA in World War II, can be viewed as little more than an imperfect nationalization, cynics might say cartelization, of what are in the profession known as the intelligence assets, including agents, contacts, etc., of these private institutions. Such collaboration between private and public was not unprecedented and clearly suited private interests as well. A U.S. ambassador in Colombia, shortly before World War II, later revealed that on his arrival, he found the embassy had no intelligence resources, but that the local officials of two major oil companies, the parents of Caltex, had organized and paid the embassy intelligence services of a kind. Caltex, of course, were and still are the dominant U.S. investment in Indonesia, accounting for 63% of Indonesian oil production, or 290,000 barrels per day in 1963. In World War II, Caltex officials supplied OSS with high-level operatives from Stockholm to Indochina, where Caltex official Lawrence Gordon established an entire spy network, the GBT network, which remained mysterious and nebulous even to regular OSS agents. OSS contacts with Ho Chi Minh were maintained by former employee first of Sukarno and then of the Allied Chase National Bank. It is indeed true from OSS and later CIA recruited agents from all walks of life, not just banks and oil companies. In Southeast Asia, however, the U.S. oil investments overshadowed all alternative varieties, missionaries, journalists, etc., of American presence. It is therefore hardly surprising that in 1963, the year in which, according to Prince Sihanouk, a U.S. decision was made to topple Sukarno, there was authoritative lobbying for an interventionist, unlimited final commitment to Southeast Asia by William Henderson, Sukarno Mobile Advisor on International Affairs. Henderson, who, as we noted, had participated with Young and John Rockefeller in the CFR 5-field study group, delivered this appeal at a conference in the Asia Society, whose founder and 1963 president was John D. Rockefeller III, succeeded in 1964 by Kenneth Todd Young. It was not a disinterested appeal. The Stanvac subsidiary of Sukarno Mobile, his employers, were on the point of signing a major oil agreement with Dr. Ibnu Sutowo of the Indonesian Army's oil company, Pertamina, trading for a takeover and a clean sweep. The essential fact about elections in 1959, Daniel Lev has written, from one point of view, was that an overwhelming communist victory seemed inevitable. In April 1958, the pro-PSI newspaper Pedoman publicly suggested that PKI chances for an absolute majority in 1959 were a good argument for postponing the elections and reconstituting the electoral system. In September, following more pressure from PSI and Masjumi leaders, a one-year postponement was announced. postponement was announced, following which the PSI and Masyumi parties turned to the army for help against the PKI. So in America did Sumitra's friend Guy Parker, who after 1958, as RAND consultant of the CIA's payroll, became closely involved with U.S. policymaking. In a series of seminal articles, Parker advocated channeling both military and economic aid to the military of Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia to strengthen them for eventually taking over. Communism is bound to win in Southeast Asia unless effective countervailing power is found in some groups who have sufficient organizational strength, goal direction, leadership, and discipline, and such groups are not likely to be found in the present political systems. Those best equipped are members of the National Officer Corps as individuals and the national armies as organizational structures. The countries of Southeast Asia have in their officer corps, with few exceptions, men who are the product of an unusual process of natural selection. This telltale throwback to the slogans of social Darwinism disguises the role in the natural selection process played by the Dutch, Japanese, and Americans. To be fair, 1965 had not yet occurred when Parker wrote the next sentence. The officer corps seemed to include some of the new country's best human material, men with above average qualities of leadership, patriotism, and commitment to moral values. In the first years of the country's independent existence, they subordinated themselves to civilian governments and administrations run by politicians and bureaucrats. Obviously, as the latter groups become discredited, as seems increasingly to be the case, the officer corps will face the choice of taking over their countries or letting the communists fill the vacuum. Current developments in Indonesia, Burma, and Laos indicate that the officer corps are not prepared to lose by default. To succeed in the competition with communism, the officer corps will need substantial economic and technical assistance. Such aid will strengthen the determination of such regimes to oppose communism. In Southeast Asia, ways must be found to utilize the organizational strength of the national armies and the leadership potential of their officer corps as temporary kernels of national integration into a genuine developmental takeoff. Such a high moral view of the Indonesian officer corps was not shared by the more objective anti-communists, on one of who conceded that in 1966, it had been no secret that the Army's involvement over the years in the bureaucracy of government and the economy has frequently been accompanied by spectacular incompetence and corruption. But Parker, in his prescription for military takeover, was reflecting the latest operational fashion among his contacts in the CIA, who had just experimented in this new approach by sponsoring the tragicomic military takeover in 1958 to 1959 in Laos. The disastrous consequences of the short-lived Laotian fiasco did not apparently modify enthusiasm for the new military economic development doctrine among the new mandarins of the Council of Foreign Relations. As Fifield wrote in his 1963 CFR blueprint, the military in Southeast Asia appears to possess many of the attributes needed for ensuring stability. The officer corps in general is dedicated to the nation, disciplined to duty, and eager to get things done. The officer corps, whose members are often well chosen, possess attributes of leadership not widely found in Southeast Asia outside the military profession. These men are a modernizing influence. If given the opportunity, it is clear that they have the ability to acquire a still wider variety of skills in management, administration, and other fields. Officers and men alike can become one of the most advanced segments of society, combining defense and development. By stepping into the gap created by the weakening or failure of the other elites, the military have been providing, in some cases, the tutelage needed to produce conditions of political stability. In August 1959, RAND sponsored a conference on the role of the military in underdeveloped countries. The resulting volume of 1962 explicitly challenged the Western sociologic bias against militarism and militaristic societies as forms of life that are morally inferior to modern industrial society. Concerning Burma and Indonesia, Parker's friend, Dr. Lucian Pai of the MIT Center, wrote as follows. Recently, it has appeared that we have been able to develop more genuine and straightforward relations with their military than any other political element. One of these relations have come further possibilities for cooperation. Military leaders are often far less suspicious of the West than civilian leaders because they themselves are more emotionally secure. Since these leaders seem to have less need to avoid realities, they are in fact easier people with whom to deal and to carry on straightforward relations. It is important, however, to note that it is essential to expand a narrow relationship with the military to a much broader one. Military aid has had to become economic aid. Military rule itself can become sterile if it does not lead to an interest in total national development. This leads us to the conclusion that the military in the underdeveloped countries can make a major contribution to strengthening essentially administrative functions. Parker's own contribution, in contrast, explicitly castigated the Indonesian military for not responding to its own exhortation of early 1959 and for helping Sukarno maintain a controlling position rather than carrying out a control function itself. A few years ago, some observers had high hopes concerning the wholesome role of the officer corps in a new and inexperienced political system such as Indonesia's. It was argued, here Parker cites his own earlier article, that the officer corps of Indonesia and of some other countries in Southeast Asia were the product of an unusual process of natural selection and included some of the new country's best human material, men with above average qualities of leadership and patriotism, as well as commitment to moral values. One was tempted to conclude that such men were fit to give the country their guidance, direction, and inspiration necessary for constructive development, as well as to exercise the control necessary in an immature democratic society facing the danger of communist subversion. Today, such optimism seems less justified, although it should not be discarded completely. The officers have not assumed full responsibility. The officer corps does not use its capabilities for reform and progress. It accepts the role of partners or even instruments of a group of emotional radical nationalists. Parker refused, however, to despair completely of a military takeover. It is presumed premature to say that the trend is irreversible. Perhaps overnight, the general staff of some younger members of the officer corps of Indonesia will strike, sweep their house clean, and rededicate themselves to higher purposes. It may turn out that current developments are only the preparatory phase of a struggle with deeper meaning. Before 1964, when the term of the present cabinet should normally expire, many of the comments made above may have been validated. Parker's carefully chosen words echoed the contemporary demand of PSI in 1959 for a national cleansing, or kinta. In 1965, they would be fulfilled, first by the Navy commander's order to the Muslim HM1 students to sweep Sakat, and later by Suharto's formal clean-out order, Directive Number 22, Koti 1965. Meanwhile, the same message was conveyed publicly in 1962 by Colonel William Kinter, a policy integrator at the CFR Fifield Seminar, who wrote from CIA-funded Foreign Policy Research Institute of his service in the CIA, the National Security Council Planning Board, the Executive Office of the President as an assistant to Nelson A. Rockefeller, and finally in the Office of the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. In Indonesia, Kinter saw the same dilemma and the same solution. If the PKI is able to maintain its legal existence and Soviet influence continues to grow, it is possible that Indonesia may be the first Southeast Asian country to be taken over by a popularly based, legally elected communist government. There are grounds for optimism, however, provided the leaders of the area, in concert with the United States and other free world nations, undertake countermeasures that are politically attuned to the needs of the region. In the meantime, with Western help, free Asian political leaders, together with the military, must not only hold on and manage, but reform and advance while liquidating the enemy's political and guerrilla armies. Now a new, better, and more seasoned program of political development is needed. By 1964 November, however, in a Rand memorandum, Parker's public optimism has still waned further. Were the communists to lose Sukarno as a protector, it seems doubtful that other national leaders capable of rallying Indonesia's dispersed and demoralized anti-communist forces would emerge in the near future. Furthermore, these forces would probably lack the ruthlessness that made it possible for the Nazis to suppress the Communist Party of Germany in the few weeks after the elections of March 5th, 1933, and an election in which the Communist Party still won 5 million votes, almost 13% of the total. The enemies of the PKI, including the remnants of various right-wing rebellions, the suppressed political parties, and certain elements in the armed forces are weaker than the Nazis, not only in numbers and in mass support, but also the unity and discipline and leadership. So you can see that, Guy Parker of Rand Corporation and the U.S. government, nexus of academic frauds and quacks, these smooth white butchers of Washington wrote very clearly that the carefully chosen words will strike and sweep their house clean and rededicate themselves to higher purpose. And he called for a national cleansing or kincha. He also called for a sikat, a sweep, which was also formally made by the Suharto to clean out order. So you can see the U.S. government, the racist white smooth butchers of Washington, calling for a genocide of the PKI in Indonesia in official publications. 4 years later, Parker would explain that the assassination of the 6 Army generals by the September 30th movement elicited the ruthlessness that I had not anticipated a year earlier and resulted in the death of a large number of communist cadres. Parker may or may not have anticipated the suppression of the PKI, but he had certainly spelt out in advance the technique for that suppression to succeed. And in February 1965, he predicted that 1965 may well mark a turning point in which power will probably shift to the younger generation of the left or of the right. Were Parker's signals to the Indonesian military challenged by any other members of America's small and centrally funded group of Indonesian experts? To date, I have not seen any countervailing evidence. Transplanting dwight from Rand and Koesno, Parker's 1962 chapter for Rand on the military in Indonesia focused on some but not all of the 1965 counter-coup principles. Among the explicitly mentioned products of natural selection are General Suharto and Ahmad Yani and former Army Chief of Staff R. Bambang Sugeng, who in the early 1960s was Indonesia's ambassador to Japan. All 3 were officers of the so-called PETA, trained by the intelligence branch of the 16th Japanese Army and later armed against the Dutch by Admiral Tadashi Maeda, who eventually returned to Indonesia as an oilman. Parker also noted that some Indonesian officers of field rank were assigned on a rotating basis to the staff and command in Bandung SSKAD for special forces. So the additional fact that you see is that Parker, nobody challenged him. Nobody challenged his words of ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Indonesian PKI and people. And that's what happened. The military of Indonesia slaughtered by the millions on the guidance of the smooth white racist butchers of Washington, the sadistic, cruel, and detached criminal butchers of Washington. Parker failed to mention his closest friend in the Indonesian military, General Suharto, the deputy commander of SSKAD, later Koesno, and an important figure in the 1965 counter-coup. In 1962, the year of Rand military volume, Parker brought Suharto to Rand to see, in Parker's words, how Rand organizes academic resources of the country as consultants. Meanwhile, the Ford Foundation's Director of International Training, John Brigham Howard, a veteran of ECA and of the U.S. aid mission to Greece in 1947 to 1948, had already launched a program which would bring to Koesno precisely the brand of training and economic development for generals which Parker, Pye, and Fifield were calling for. This program cost Ford $2.5 million, a part of an overall Ford program of $13 million in grants to Indonesia by 1963. Ransom quotes Howard as saying the program was ambitious for a definite purpose. Ford felt it was training the guys who would be leading the country when Sukarno got out. Ford's representative in Indochina from 1955 to 1961 was Michael Harris, a former CIO organizer and chief of the labor division of the ECA Special Mission to France in 1948, the year in which the CIA first secretly financed the non-communist Socialist Union in France. Harris was also vice chairman of the Asia Society's Indonesian Council. Frank Miller, who replaced Harris in 1961, left behind him charges of CIA involvement at his previous Ford posting in Pakistan after it was discovered that his senior advisor of rural industries, Dr. Ray Kelly from Stanford Research Institute, had worked earlier on a conveyor military operations research project for the Department of Defense. David Ransom's carefully documented study of this program showed how Ford reached CESCODE via Sumitro's Faculty of Economics at Jakarta, staffed by students of Sumitro and who in key instances were also close associates of Parker. Ransom records how the head of the Ford-sponsored team from Berkeley, Leonard Doyle, was abruptly recalled from Jakarta in 1958 after Harris failed to get Doyle to hire 2 or 3 Americans who were close to the exiled Sumitro. In Doyle's words, I felt the university should not be involved in what essentially was becoming a rebellion against the government. One of these men, William Hollinger, returned to Indonesia after the counter-coup under the auspices of Harvard's Developmental Advisory Services and the Ford Foundation. Key colleagues of the Sumitro at the economics faculty of Jakarta were by 1962 traveling regularly to CESCODE in Bandung to teach what Ford's Frank Miller called the economic aspects of defense. 2 of these professors, who would later be prominent in Suharto's economic brain trust, were former Sumitro students Mohammed Sadli, who had shared a duplex with Parker at Berkeley, and with Jojo Nitasastro, who had studied under Parker at Berkeley. The importance of this coalition between Suharto, CESCODE, and the conspiratorial PSI of Sumitro is underlined improvingly by Parker's friend Robert Chaplin. It was the basis for reorienting the army to Dwi-Fungsi doctrine of military economic development. Bandung has always been an important center of power because, among other things, it is the site of the Army's staff and command school and the home base of the Siliwangi Division, the nation's most prestigious military unit. Over the years, the Siliwangi's tradition of intellectual and political enlightenment was influenced particularly by contacts with the Indonesian Socialist Party, PSI, which was finally outlawed under Sukarno because of the involvement in the CIA-backed 1958 revolt. Suharto, who never finished secondary school, became acquainted with some of the PSI leaders while attending the staff and command school in 1960 to 1961. A number of PSI-oriented academicians are now part of his economic and political brain trust. The staff and command school was built into a remarkable military institution by General Suharto, who died of cancer in 1967. Suharto, an unusually broad-gauged and politically sophisticated officer, was also close to the PKI. When I saw him, he was actively engaged in reorienting the Army's thinking so they could rediscover the true revolutionary role. The task of Suharto and his staff, in the words of Guy Parker, a close friend of Suharto's, was to convince as many as possible of the Army's 150 general officers and 400 colonels that it was the responsibility to maintain the delicate balance between the representative democratic principle, which makes parties and policemen a necessary evil in any polity, and the corporative principle, which gives the Army the means to participate in the government without creating a military dictatorship. In this, Suharto was acting president. Suharto's full support, launching at once into a discussion of the importance of the military in underdeveloped nations. He, Suharto, came directly to the point to make military men aware that while in the past the emphasis has been on ideology and politics, it must now be on development. Parker, in an interview with Ransom, dated the political role of CESCODE back to Suharto's visit to Rand in 1962, and he too noted the importance of visiting PSI academicians from the Jakarta Faculty of Economics. In Ransom's words, according to Parker, Suharto had a new idea when he returned to Bandung. The 4 or 5 economists became, as at Rand, cleared social scientists lecturing and studying the future political problems in Indonesia in Cisco. In effect, this group became the Army's high-level civilian advisors. They were joined at Cisco by the other PSI and Miss Jumi alumni of the university programs, as well as senior faculty from the nearby Bandung University of Technology, where the University of Kentucky has been institution building for aid since 1957. Consolidating the Army for takeover, the Bandung Technological Facility, as it happened, was that charged with training engineers in and for the rapidly expanding bureaucracy of Pertamina. American institutions also participated in the training of Indonesia's generals for a new political role. It was much the same as the Chile in a decade earlier. While relations between the U.S. and Sukarno deteriorated and resulted in the gradual cutting off of all economic and financial aid to the Indonesian government between 1962 and 1965, U.S. aid to the Indonesian military was stepped up at a time of increasing financial pressures. Throughout the withholding of economic aid, military grants increased 35.8 million in the 4 years 1962 to 1965, with a peak of 16 million in 1962, as opposed to 29.5 million for the 13 years 1949 to 1961. Whereas some 250 Indonesian officers had been trained in the U.S. by 1958 and 500 by 1962, the number had grown to 4,000 by 1965. In addition, beginning in 1962, hundreds of visiting officers at Harvard and Syracuse gained the skills for maintaining a huge economic as well as military establishment, with training in everything from business administration and personnel management to air photography and shipping. Harlan Cleveland, for years the dean of Syracuse's School of Public Affairs, a participant in the Rockefeller Special Studies Project, and before that the director of ECA's China program, was also the chairman of the CFR's 1959 study group on Southeast Asia. In practice, direct participation of development by the Army and the oil bureaucracy of Pertamina, bypassing the rest of the state, dated back to the Army anti-communist operations of the 1950s. The Manipul program in 1959 of increasing socialism, though it contributed to Sukarno's increasingly bad image, was in fact a golden opportunity to translate military economic development from the RAND drawing boards into practice. The decline of parliamentary democracy saw more and more generals in key administrative posts, with Ibnu Sutowo exercising more and more autonomous control over the application of Pertamina's foreign exchange earnings. By about 1959, this Army's oil sub-economy had been called a creeping coup d'etat by some Western journalists. A similar and closely related anomaly can be observed in the post-war statistics for multinational oil investment in Indonesia. In the 1950s, Indonesia and the big oil companies failed to come to terms for new oil exploration contracts, and instead the companies developed and ran down their existing pre-war oil fields. In the early 1960s, even as Sukarno moved to begin 1963 and then accelerate August 1965, the nationalism of the three giant foreign oil companies, Caltex, Shell, and Stanvac, there was a flurry of new announcements, speculations, and governmental contracts for new exploration and drilling in Indonesia. Part of the explanation for this paradox lay in improved research and technology, in part in increased local demand, particularly in Japan. In 1957, de Goyler and McNaughton of Dallas had prepared a promising geological survey of Sumatra. In 1958, the first offshore drilling rig arrived in the South China Sea. After the proclamation of martial law and amid a flurry of rumors and speculations in New York, the first of the new agreements was negotiated in December 1957, not with the recalcitrant Indonesian government, but with the Indonesian Army's company Pertamina under Ibnu Sutowo, whom fortune would later praise as the paragon of developmental-minded generals. Ibnu Sutowo was advised on his contract by Indonesia's planning chief Ali Budiarjo, member of the intimate Jakarta political study group founded by Guy Parker. Pertamina signed its contract with American independents on the cover of Canadian companies Harold Hutton of Refining Associates, T.L. Brook of Asmer Oil, and with the Japanese. Ibnu Sutowo, Pertamina, and Japan. Japan's access to badly needed Indonesian oil had been worsened by Premier Kishi and his negotiating representative, A. Kobayashi, as part of the March 1958 Japanese reparations. Kishi later recalled that when he visited Indonesia for reparations discussion in 1957, the young Colonel Ibnu had impressed me and my advisors as a good leader worth supporting. It had turned out to be an excellent association. In 1955, Admiral Maida, in whose residence the Sukarno Hatta independence announcement of 1945 had been drafted, returned to Indonesia to talk oil. So did his wartime assistant S. Nishijima, who in 1957 served as member of Kobayashi's War Reparations Commission. In 1960, Ibnu Sutowo signed his first Japanese contract with the North Sumatra Oil Development Corporation Company, Mossadegh of Kobayashi's investment group, a contract arranged by Mossadeg's future managing director, Nishijima. Obviously, Japanese foreign expansion into Indonesia made little attempt to disguise the inevitable interaction of political intelligence and financial considerations. By 1963, as we have seen, the big U.S. oil companies, Caltex and Stanback, had agreed to the new 60-40 production sharing formula accepted earlier by the independents. Each of these contracts required a $5 million signature bonus payment at the outset of the new exploration. 1964 was the year in which Defense Secretary McNamara tightened the credit screws on Indonesia, the year in which Parker professed despair. Yet, from another source, we learned that the prospects of the international oil companies in Indonesia during 1964 looked more promising than for the past 2 decades. Each of the three paid the necessary $5 million bonus before beginning its survey work, and each spent money freely in attempts to discover the possibilities of its new areas. Stanback, for example, reports that it spent $3 million in the first year of work contract with Pertamina, as against the obligation to spend only $1 million. U.S. dollars were no longer flowing from government to government, but from corporation to corporation. The effect of this was to strengthen even further the Army Pertamina sub-economy at the expense of the rest. 1965 was a year of political polarization in the Indonesian oil industry, paralleling the intensifying that in the nation as a whole. This was one of the factors in the erosion of Sukarno's power to mediate. Oil Minister Salah's move in March to supervise the oil industry and in August to nationalize the refineries were in fact weak responses to increasingly militant demands from PKI oil workers for immediate and total nationalization. But the PKI's moves, like the corresponding reactions to army crackdowns on government estates, for example, the so-called Bandar Betsy affair of May 1965, were themselves responses to growing army economic power, which by now was very great. After September 5th, 1965, in the wake of Sukarno's proclamation of economic self-reliance, economic powers were vested in a new 5-man self-reliance command. Of the 5, 4 were generals, including Army Intelligence Chief Ahmad Sekendra from General Yani's Brain Trust. It seems to be conceded that foreign oil money, channeled or laundered through Pertamina, was an important, if not indispensable, factor in the success of the counter-coup. Suharto's army, as the Wall Street Journal noted in 1967, could not survive on its regularly budgeted funds. Most of this foreign exchange was American, and Sutowo is known to have been personally rewarded with a minimum of $500,000 US dollars from U.S. oil executives and or their corporations in particular. But Sutowo's good relations with Japanese oilmen, dating from Admiral Maida's return to Indonesia in 1958, appear also to have been important to the success of Suharto's nominally anti-colonialist military development complex. The Japanese right-winger Sasakawa Rochi, close both to Kishi and the Kobayashi group, is said to have boasted publicly of his role in the 1965 Suharto counter-coup. Sasakawa was a Japanese sponsor of Asian People's Anti-Communist League, a group implicated in U.S. Army unconventional warfare and CIA conspiratorial activities in Burma, Laos, and Cambodia. Many observers have noted the same complex of CIA plotters, Japanese secret societies, and oil behind the bloody Cambodian coup in 1970, in which the CIA, Suharto's army, and Sasakawa's circle were again involved. Once again, it was Ibnu Sutowo's oil company, now called Pertamina, which paid the expenses of Jakarta Conference, of a regional neo-colonial powers which attempted to stabilize the post-coup conditions in Cambodia. Such collaboration reminds us that the securing of oil regions for development takes priority over commercial competition between independents and oil majors, or between Japanese and American firms. Such collaboration appears to have been particularly strong in Indonesia, where the independents acted in a more venturesome way, but to open up the region for exploration by the more conservative oil majors, with whom they later signed farm-out agreements. Kishi himself made no moves to bring Japanese capital to Indonesia until he had visited Washington and discussed with Eisenhower ways in which free Asian countries might be further assisted in developing their economies. He then visited New York to be hosted successively by John Rockefeller III, the Council of Foreign Relations, and the Rockefeller-funded Japan Society. The most important Japanese oil company to enter Indonesia before 1965 was the Mitsubishi Oil Company, which was then almost 50% owned by the oil interests of Jean Paul Getty, one of the largest or the least wealthiest personal contribution to the campaigns of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Like Howard Hughes, Getty was one of those select few who in 1972 was asked to contribute directly to Nixon via Bebe Rebozo, rather than through the legal and accountable political committees. Mitsui was also negotiating with Suharto through Admiral Maida, and Mitsui, through their American representative Henry Kearns, transferred their law business to the law firms of Kearns' close friend Richard Nixon. In 1964, Nixon and Kearns traveled together to Asia, where Nixon addressed the APAC Congress. In 1965, Nixon campaigned for the bombing of North Vietnam to protect the immense mineral potential of Indonesia, and shortly before the coup, he warned at least one Australian audience that the free nations cannot allow Indonesia to go communist any more than Vietnam. Several insiders' stock purchases in the small independent company Asamara Oil suggest that this company's officials at least may have anticipated the anti-communist actions of October 1965. Shortly after World Oil reported in its August 15th issue that Indonesia's gas and oil industry appeared to be slipping deeper into the political morass, Asamara's president T.L. Brooke purchased 200,000 shares of his company on stock options for $50,000, so as almost to double his investment. Ironically, this double purchase on September 9th and September 21st was reported in the Wall Street Journal of September 30th, 1965, the day of Untung's coup. The contingency planning of General Yani's brain trust. Years of American exhortation and training in military economic development, backed now by a new influx of foreign exchange, strengthened the resolve of Indonesia's army clique to deal with anti-communists abroad rather than with Sukarno at home. The fruit of this resolve in 1965 was the anti-communist contingency planning of Army Chief of Staff Yani's Council of Generals. Concerning this council, fear of which helped precipitate the September 30th coup of Colonel Tung, let us for the moment limit ourselves to those facts which are conceded by anti-communist sources like Chaplin, Parker, and Brackman. According to Chaplin, the council, which they did not call it, was just a group of senior officers formed by General Ahmad Yani, the Army Chief of Staff, to meet from time to time to discuss the political matter and some internal army affairs. It seems unlikely that loosely formed group of generals had conceived any plot to grab power. However, they may have been a secret set of contingency plans to respond to any communist power play in order to take care of any emergency when Sukarno was no longer around. Chaplin omits from his account the very relevant fact that Sukarno's health, which was being closely monitored for Yani's generals by the CIA, was reported to be failing badly following a public collapse in early August 1965. Thus, contingency plans of both factions were now likely to be activated, the only question being which side would strike first against the other. Parker later admitted it was an open secret that Yani and his informal brain trust, who he names, were discussing contingency plans to prevent chaos, and noted that he had alluded to such private political discussions in the July 1962 issue of the CFR journal Foreign Affairs. Yani's group, moreover, was in contact with the American authorities, especially through the then Army Intelligence Chief General Parman, killed on October 1st, and his successor, General Ahmad Sukarno, who had recently returned from special training at the University of Pittsburgh. According to Brackman, this contact was apparently used by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, May 11, 1966, to justify past United States appeasement of the Sukarno regime with military aid. McNamara implied that such aid enabled Washington to maintain contact with the Indonesian general staff. The following month, June 1966, James Reston, a columnist in the New York Times, wrote that there was a great deal more contact between the Indonesian High Command and Washington before September 30th than is generally realized. Through what channels was the contact maintained? Colonel Tung charged on October 1st that his coup had intended only to forestall a counter coup designed by Yani's Council of Generals for Armed Forces Day on October 5th with the support of the CIA. The CIA contact, he claimed, was William Palmer, the local representative of the U.S. motion picture industry in Indonesia. Former U.S. Ambassador Howard Jones, the man who, in Fifield's words, came to personify Washington's post-1958 policy of building up the forces behind General Nasution, promptly denied the charge of Yani's CIA plot. He did not deny that Palmer was a CIA agent, however. On the contrary, he called Palmer one of the best friends of the country had, which might suggest that Palmer was more than just a motion picture representative. Needless to say, Jones did not point out that Palmer's predecessor in his capacity a decade earlier had been Matthew Fox, the CIA's contact with Sukarno. William Palmer, about whom American sources have since still been silent, was in fact a resident agent of influence in the CIA, while his brother Howard, and as an OSS veteran, was now legal counsel for the Arabian American Oil Company, owned by the parent companies of Caltex and Stanvik. Nor do American sources mention that in May 1964, shortly after the CIA-supported coup of the Brazilian generals, which Le Monde reported under the precedent guideline, the end of Kennedyism, the CIA sent a new and clearly activist chief of station to Jakarta. He was Bernardo Tovar, a naturalized Colombian who had spent years in the Philippines with the CIA's Edward Lansdale in the early 1950s. Tovar's experience with the military and unconventional military situation was further recognized when he became the CIA station chief in Laos in 1970 and then Bangkok in 1973. In June 1965, Tovar was joined by the U.S. Ambassador Marshall Green, who as a Foreign Service officer in Seoul from 1959 to 1961 had had direct experience of the CIA-sponsored replacement of Syngman Rhee by the military regime of Chung-hee Park. Because of the role of students in that eventual military takeover, Green was widely suspected in Indonesia of encouraging the student activists in the post-coup purge of the PKI. The students had been trained militarily for civil defense in anticipation of a PKI takeover. Some of them had toured America under a project of the CIA-subsidized National Student Association. An Australian scholar reports that Green, as ambassador to Canberra, has repeatedly stressed to Australian audiences that, in the curious chain of events around September 30th, we did what we had to do, and you'd better be glad we did it, because if we hadn't, Asia would be a different place today. It seems to be conceded, moreover, that Yani's generals were in close military contact with U.S. Army attaché Willis G. Ethel, who returned on March 17, 1964, for an unusual second posting to the U.S. Embassy. The AFL-CIO and International Confederation for Free Trade Unions, working with the CIA, helped the Indonesian army develop a splinter union faction, SOCSI, while the CIA-sponsored Congress of Cultural Freedom maintained links with the PSI Mazzumi intellectuals and academics. David Ransom's extensive researches suggests, however, that the political activists were the PSI academicians who, in Parker's words, were cleared in Rand fashion for studying political problems at CESCO. The economists were quickly caught up in the anti-communist conspiracy directed at toppling the Sukarno regime and encouraged by Sumitro, from his Singapore exile. Lieutenant General Ahmad Yani, Army Commander-in-Chief, had drawn around him a brain trust of generals. It was an open secret, says Parker, that Yani and his brain trust were discussing contingency plans which were to prevent chaos should Sukarno die suddenly. The contribution of Suharto's mini Rand, according to Colonel Willis G. Ethel, U.S. Defense Attaché in Jakarta, and a close confidant of Commander-in-Chief Yani and others in the Army High Command, was that the professors would run a course in this contingency planning. Of course, the Army planners were worried about preventing chaos. They were worried about the PKI. They weren't about to let the communists take over the country, Ethel says. They also knew that there was immense popular support for Sukarno and the PKI, and that a great deal of blood would flow when the showdown finally came. The order to clean out subversive. There are, of course, many unresolved issues about the coup and post-coup developments of 1965. One of these is the relationship between Yani's contingency plans and the actual bloodbath which followed. Anti-communist accounts currently attribute the latter, at least in scope, to irrational and spontaneous factors such as popular anger. In two different accounts, we are told that the baseline terror assumed the quality of mass exorcism, as if they were ridding the soil of their soul and their souls of evil and purifying themselves. These same sources concede, however, that the slaughter started as a political cleansing, the long-awaited Kinja of Parker and the PSI. Even if there were excesses behind what Suharto planned for, at least one CIA civilian protege, Mohammed Nasir, who returned to a less prominent role in Suharto's new order, protested the extent of carnage. So you can see the U.S. government, basically, they had infiltrated the ideology, parasitized the ideology of the Indonesian, PSI Mesjumi, as well as the military. And what you see is anti-communist accounts recurrently attribute the latter, or the contingency plans, to irrational and spontaneous factors such as popular anger. In two different accounts, we are told that baseline terror assumed the quality of mass exorcism, as if they were trying to rid the soil and their souls of evil and purifying themselves of the other people. This is the racist white butchers of the U.S. government, the racist white smooth butchers of Washington. In addition, the Kinza that Parker and the PSI, started was a political cleansing, a political mass murder genocide by the U.S. government, smooth butchers of Washington. The origins of this cleansing were not at the base, at the top. Nasution's call for liquidation of the PKI, Suharto's clean-out directive to liquidate the remnants of the counter-revolutionary September 30th movement, and his personal choice of General Eddy and his paratroopers to begin the purge in Central Java. No one, to my knowledge, has dared suggest that a major bloodletting was not part of the anti-communist contingency planning. For a minority movement to liquidate a broadly based one, nothing short of Parker's ruthlessness could be contemplated. The Madian affair of 1948, in which General Nasution had put down a short-lived left-wing revolt, had already made it clear that the armed forces would resort to mass murder as part of their struggle. The only question was, on what scale? Events since the purge suggest that estimated 500,000 deaths were too few rather than too many for the successful implementation of the Yani, Nasution, Suharto contingency plan. The mid-1968 counterinsurgency operations in the South Blitar area of East Java resulted in 2,000 additional deaths. Today, the number of political prisoners in Indonesia, some of them held continuously since 1965, is estimated variously at between 35,000 and 200,000, probably exceeding those of any other nation in the world. The riots of January 15, 1974, provoked in part by Indonesia's worsening economic crisis as a result of American failed capitalism, resulted in over 300 casualties and the worst damage to Jakarta since World War II. Western observers such as Malcolm Caldwell predict that the PKI, which was far and away the most broadly and strongly organized Indonesian movement in 1965, will again mount an effective challenge to Suharto's dictatorship. There are other indications that the bloody tactic of clean sweep has resolved few, if any, of Indonesia's long-term economic problems. Despite a speeded-up exploitation of Indonesia's oil and lumber resources, despite the predictable reinfusion of U.S. aid after the coup. Indonesia's economic and social prospects have continued to worsen. According to Cheryl Payer, Sukarno left a legacy of over $2 billion in debts, but the new debts of the Suharto regime, plus projected foreign financing of the remainder of the 5-year plan to 1974, added up to more than $4 billion, with the annual rate of new credits expanding from 175 million in 1966 to an estimated 910 million in 1973 to 1974. About half of this foreign debt has been run up by Ibnu Sutowo's pertamina. As in the case of Saigon, most of these credits have gone to finance imports, not for local development, but to sustain the exaggerated lifestyle of a new ruling class, above all Parker's economists generals, in which corruption, particularly in pertamina, is again endemic. The results of Western aid as administered by the International Monetary Fund and the Asian Development Bank have been a swath of domestic bankruptcies in the wake of the IMF-enforced contraction of local bank credit and competition from aid-financed imports. The IMF's policies have been supervised by World Bank President Robert McNamara, architects both of the Vietnam War and of Johnson's credit squeeze on Sukarno in 1964 to 1965. McNamara's first trip in his new job as IBRD president was to visit Indonesia. The Far Eastern Economic Review warned in 1970 that the Indonesian economy can expect eventually to be strangled by its foreign liabilities just as the economy starts to get off the ground. Do donors really intend to force Jakarta into bankruptcy in the long run, or does the West believe the enormous debts are essential to control Suharto? It is in this context that we must assess the appalling consequence in 1965 of the CFR, the Council of Foreign Relations, RAND, Ford Foundation, long-range blueprints for Indonesia's military economic development. The real issue is not who shot first in 1965, American proteges around General Yani, as some claim, or as others claim, the PKI. Nor can I explore here Malcolm Caldwell's hypothesis that Suharto and or the CIA may have infiltrated an agent provocateur, Stiam, a veteran of Suharto's Siliwangi division, into the Tung faction to incite what one Harvard-trained anti-communist called a long-awaited legitimation for a determined assault against the extreme left. The obscurity surrounding these details may never be fully dispelled. America's root responsibility for the events of 1965 is on a deeper level. It stems from its sustained and conspiratorial projection of its European model for anti-communist success in 1959 CFR paradigm of military economic development as pronounced officially by Lyndon Johnson on April 7, 1965, upon a country where there was no conceivable hope of this blueprint's peaceful implementation. Parker's exhortations under RAND auspices for his Indonesian friends to displace Sukarno and sweep their house clean are only a more conspicuous instance of continuing U.S. policy to divide and polarize the politics of Indonesia, as earlier in Laos and later in Cambodia, to the point where the local generals will ultimately, as a matter of survival, declare war on the largest domestic population. The policy of communist, anti-communist polarization to which the CIA once cheerfully confessed in Laos held out prospects which were predictably lethal and whose countervailing economic benefits from the point of view of Indonesia as opposed to America were much less clear. Not all of the participants in America's military economic aid programs went along with the more controversial features of the underlying paradigm. Some correctly foresaw that the morally superior general with a flair for economics would prove to be as hard to find in Indonesia as he had been in Laos. In January 10, 1966, in the wake of the bloodbath, some members of the Ford-funded Modern Indonesia project at Cornell circulated a 162-page confidential paper questioning the Suharto version of events and suggesting that the Tung coup was less a PKI conspiracy than an internal army affair which planned to exploit the PKI under the guise of the smooth butchers of Washington. However, caught between the political realities of their forward backers and of the new Jakarta regime, the so-called Cornell paper was marked strictly confidential and remained so until 1971, when Joseph Kraft, another journalist with good inside CIA and CFR contacts, cited the paper's thesis in calling the subsequent Indonesian massacre a true tragedy. Project director George McTee-Cahin, who was publicly opposing Guy Parker on the issue of the Vietnam War, wrote to dissociate the Cornell project completely from Mr. Kraft's evaluation and judgment of Indonesia's most recent past. For the most part, the U.S. establishment and academic accounts of the coup and its aftermath have echoed this strangely complacent and unreal tone of descriptions of Ngo Dinh Diem's economic miracle in the years 1956 to 1959. In this, they follow the example set in February 1966 by Richard Stebbins, the CFR's historian. According to Colonel Untung himself, he had been obliged to take the initiative in order to forestall another rightist plot against Sukarno, which allegedly was being prepared by a group of anti-communist generals linked to the United States Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. government. Such charges were, of course, a favorite method of denigrating political opponents in a number of countries, and Washington's routine denials offered little enlightenment as to the extent to which American agents now took part in behind-the-scenes maneuvers of the sort that had occurred in Indonesia, among other countries in the past years. But whether or not the U.S. representatives have been in contact with anti-communist elements in Indonesia before the coup, subsequent developments bore all the earmarks of an authentic national anti-communist revulsion. An even more remarkable feature of these disordered weeks was a profound and unmistakable popular revulsion against communist China. By the end of the year, estimates of the number of persons killed in nationwide anti-communist reaction run to over 100,000 or more. The curbing of Sukarno and communists unquestionably spelled a major setback for communist China, not only in Indonesia itself, but the other countries of the Asian African world, as well as its worldwide competition with the USSR on the one side and the United States on the other. For Indonesia itself, it presented a new opportunity for development along saner and more constructive lines. Stebbins' periods are deliberately balanced, but the deeper message is crude. Whether or not the U.S. was involved, the magnitude of the massacres proved it was authentic and popular. The consensus in America, which could thus accept a bloodbath as an opportunity for saner development, had, by its lack of condemnation, paved the way for repeat performances. The Cambodian bloodbath of 1970, in which the CIA and the Indonesian army both played a role, and most recently, the Chilean bloodbath of 1973. So you can see an excellent chapter by Peter Dale Scott, pretty much ending the book. There's just two more little sections. I'll do those tomorrow. There's a little letter by an appendix letter, and just one little segment. I will wait till tomorrow and finish those, but I want to just review and make some closing remarks. So basically, in summary, the United States smooth, detached, sadistic, cruel, racist butchers of Washington, you can see, had a paradigm for Indonesian military establishment. They did 7 years of research using both American academic white anti-communist frauds and U.S. mass media anti-communist and colonial frauds being directed by the U.S. government, including John Foster Dulles, Lyndon Johnson, Dwight Eisenhower, the State Department, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the CIA. This gradual project involved the slow, insidious, parasitic takeover of Indonesian profit-producing businesses, civilian and defense sector, by members of the Indonesian military elite establishment. Though the establishment of the Indonesian military generals, when getting intricately involved in civilian circles in high-profit companies in Indonesia, Washington was thus able to control the cash flow through the establishment, through the notorious military generals Suharto, Yani, and Nasution. Over time, the CIA had continued to study the economic model in Indonesia, and an eye to having American companies basically take over the business cash flow through the military generals. They deliberately had a relationship with Sukarno under the pretext of providing Sukarno with economic and military aid. And they justified this aid secretly to stay in touch with the military generals for the correct moment to strike out at Sukarno. Remember, President Koesno Sukarno was highly revered by his people and had been the democratic ruler of Indonesia since 1949, when the country was first proclaimed independent of Dutch colonial rule. Sukarno was very much a patriot. He was a loyal servant of his people, and he was a pro-Indonesian national. Other people similar to him I compare to Mao Zedong of China and Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam. His model for progress was not accepted by Washington. The smooth butchers of Washington went completely against him. He was interested in several things. He wanted sovereignty over his natural resources like oil, timber, rice, copra cakes, coffee, tobacco, palm oil, palm kernels, and pepper, and tea and hard fibers. He also tried nationalizing the oil company Pertamina, similar to Mossadegh in Iran. His nationalist push was not viewed favorably in Washington. The strong base of support, which was the PKI, accounted for about 30 to 40% of the population of Indonesia. Such a base cannot be easily subverted, and the United States not only did not accept it was not right to overthrow the democratic and populist leader of Indonesia, Sukarno, but they also were interested in exterminating or cleansing the PKI, as directly stated by Guy Parker of Rand. The smooth white racist butchers of Washington were extremely sadistic, detached, and cruel in their treatment of the Indonesian people. When a group of people is about 30 to 40% of the population of a country, and you have a plan to murder them, that is genocide and should be avoided at all costs. Washington openly confronted this wall of moral conscience by providing the military of Indonesia that was trained by the United States to be ruthless and willing to shed blood with no limits of bound. The smooth, sadistic butchers of Washington were waiting when the military generals were discussing overthrow of Sukarno and were being advised by the U.S. government. The deranged criminal psychopaths of Washington fed extensive genocidal hardware into the hands of the military generals. They also secretly compiled lists of PKI members that they wanted murdered by the generals of Indonesia, and provided them to the generals for extermination of the PKI. They had PSI Massumi, including Marshall Green, instigate student activists with propaganda that the communists were mutilating the military generals' genital organs, and they were witch hunting PKI members, murdering their people secretly in their houses. Recounts of electric chairs in PKI houses to kill people in Indonesia were fabricated in the Indonesian military press and propaganda, causing the most extensive bloodshed in Indonesia and probably the worst form of human slaughter throughout the world, which is only comparable in terms of magnitude to that of Hitler. Beginning in the Eisenhower administration, a new strategy for combating the PKI was developed. Since the PKI were very nationalist and against American colonialism and racist oppression by the smooth butchers of Washington, there was a sophisticated strategy employed by the National Security Council. The party was well organized, highly disciplined, and extremely popular among the Indonesian people. The NSC's assessment was that the PKI would probably have emerged the largest party in Indonesia if Sukarno had not canceled the scheduled election for 1959. The army could not simply attack the PKI and the communists in a pit bull fashion, the way Washington often attacks people, and Washington attacked Indochina in Vietnam. Open measures of repression against the PKI would be difficult to justify on internal political grounds and would expose any government undertaking them of charges of truckling down to Western pressures. The army would have to approach the PKI carefully. Any attack on the party would have to be justified in the very terms of Indonesian nationalism that the party itself championed. The trick was to frame the Communist Party into having taken a rash action that would make it appear anti-national. The NSC document of 1959 emphasized that the United States, in providing aid to the Indonesian army, should prioritize requests for assistance of programs that were against PKI, opportunities to isolate the PKI and drive it into positions of open opposition to the Indonesian government and military establishment, and thereby create the grounds for repressive measures, including genocide and extermination, politically justifiable in terms of Indonesian self-interest. The consistent U.S. strategy from 1959 to 1965 was to help the Army officers prepare themselves for a violent attack upon the PKI. Howard Jones, the ambassador to Jakarta for 7 years from 1958 to 1965, and one of the main architects of the policy, supplied an important element of the continuity for the administration. In accordance with this policy, the U.S. government trained Indonesian military officers in the United States, donated and sold weapons secretly to the military without knowledge of Sukarno, and provided abundant financial aid to General Nasution, who was the commander of the army and was America's golden boy. And his firm commitment to be a stooge of the Western colonial powers had convinced the smooth butchers of white racist Washington that the army was the best hope for containing the Communist Party. The U.S. justified aid to the Indonesian army in 1958 and encouraged Nasution to carry out his plan for Washington colonial sovereignty over Indonesia. After Sukarno shunted Nasution aside in 1962 June, he was promoted to an administrative position as chief of the armed forces and relieved of troop command. Lieutenant General Ahmad Yani continued and was, instated in that position as representatives of the colonial Washington regime. He continued the same policies as General Nasution. The United States had spent $10 to $20 million and intensively trained the Indonesian officers in schools such as Fort Bragg and Fort Leavenworth in the United States. 2,800 Indonesian army officers were brought specifically and paid for to the United States for training, most of them after 1958. That is about 1/4 of the total Indonesian armed forces. The U.S. thus developed secretive contacts with the Indonesian army. Most of the officers thus trained were behind Washington's interest in openly colonizing Indonesia. In 1964, Dean Rusk wrote to President Johsnon essentially that the aid we are giving the generals is permitting us good contact with the key elements in Indonesia that will allow us to complete the colonization process. There was also a big civic action by the U.S. government. The U.S. government used the military on projects useful to the local population and was intended to give the army generals the activities normally that were reserved for civilians. Soldiers were to become officials within the civilian government, such as village heads, and work on infrastructure and long-term plans for future colonial rule. The National Security Council endorsed the idea of strengthening the Indonesian Army's role of economic and social developer in Indonesia. The Indonesian Army's newly christened Civic Action Program was under the control of Colonel George Benson, whose official title from August 1962 to 1965, July, Special Assistant to the U.S. Ambassador for Civic Action. Benson had enjoyed the full and open access to all secretive Indonesian military participation in civic action and was very good friends with Ahmad Yani. Benson knew Yani previously as U.S. military attaché at the Jakarta embassy in 1956 to 1959, and so was allowed to work freely in Indonesia as a member of the colonial United States government to essentially dismember the democracy of Indonesia secretly. The NSC committee declassified document reports that money would be given to support civic action and anti-Indonesian nationalist activities that would involve the covert training of selected personnel and civilians who will be placed in key positions in the censored words civic action program. The many excised passages in the declassified document is an open admission of guilt by the smooth white racist butchers of Washington to conduct a state within a state in Indonesia in which the democracy is controlled by Sukarno, but the economy and military are controlled by Washington. Further, they contest the strategic sites in civil society prior to launching their attack on state power. The army had Golkar Functional Group, which was the only political party and splinter union faction, COSI, centralist organization of socialist employees in Indonesia, an extremist group that sees unemployment as a result of too many people rather than too few jobs, for which the solution is genocide. Newspapers such as Angkatan Bersenjata were controlled by the military. A group of cultural figures who worked closely with anti-communist officers were also included in the military entrenched bureaucracy. By sprouting the broad and extensive subversion of civilian military organizations through the entrenched military dictatorship under the guise of the smooth, racist white butchers of Washington, the army was transforming itself to a state within a state. The army was then slowly able to become involved in civilian politics. Martial law was introduced and was to become the army's political charter. The regional army commanders restricted the press, arrested politicians arbitrarily, and imposed their own unwritten laws on the people. The nationalization of the Dutch colonial businesses in 1957 by the Sukarno allowed the army an opportunity to enter the economy. Many army commanders became wealthy businessmen, turning handsome profits from plantations, factories, import and export ventures, and illegal smuggling. They accumulated sizable funds to bankroll their efforts to invade strategic areas of Indonesia, all while Sukarno was the democratically elected president. General Nasution even pushed for a corporatist military state in the early 1960s in which political parties would be abolished and the public sphere evacuated of political contestation. In 1958, veteran politician Shahir warned that the Nasution's army general officers harbored a militaristic and fascist ideal of the Indonesian government. The U.S. government felt that Asian governments could be better controlled by fascist military dictatorship, which could allow for chattel slavery of the people and starvation, famine, and genocide as benefits of their American colonial rule. The military, they felt, had the best interest of the people in mind. Political academic white fraud, Dr. Lucian Pai of the MIT academic nexus of quacks, suggested that armies in developing countries could be modernizing agents since they tend to emphasize a rational outlook and to champion responsible change and national development through genocide, famine, chattel slavery, and rampant prostitution. He further states, just give me 1 second, it just skipped. He further states that Army officers appreciated technological advancement and could promote a sense of citizenship and were capable of strengthening essential administrative functions. So let us assess Dr. Pai's interest in military rule in Indonesia from what happened after the military dictatorship took place. The rational outlook of murdering all PKI members in order to stop dissent, to me, does not promote a rational outlook or a responsible change for nationalist development. Their interest in technological advancement includes murder through genocidal technology and gun violence resolution of disputes, as occurs in the United States, again not promoting a sense of citizenship among the people, nor strengthening essential administrative functions. Walt Ristow headed a team at the State Department and wrote a paper on the role I apologize again, it just skipped again. Almost here. Basically, they also wrote a paper on the role of the military in the underdevelopment of countries that endorse disregarding civilian supremacy in favor of military supremacy. The state, he recommended, should be controlled by the military and there should be no input from the people. Guy Parker, who was affiliated with Rand Corporation and University of California, Berkeley, noticed that Nasution was following a clever long-term strategy in making the Indonesian army into an organization that would support American colonial rule. Nasution was waiting until the army was tightly knit and entrenched itself throughout the civilian sector as well as the economy. Parker reiterated that the army was the only hope for American colonial rule in Indonesia. Parker struck up a relationship with the Army Staff College Vice Director, Colonel Suharto, who was grooming his fellow officers for their future role as rulers. He was a personal enemy of Sukarno and was graduated from the 1959 U.S. military training program at Fort Leavenworth. Suharto and the Army generals tried to work a subtle fashion. They arranged for U.S.-trained economists to come to Bandung and teach seminars for the officers in training. These economists received special training in the nexus of academic frauds, on white frauds at the United States University of California at Berkeley, funded by the Ford Foundation in Lavish. Berkeley professor Bruce Glassburner spent 3 years in Indonesia, 1958 to 1961, and later recalled that the army officers at CESCODE wanted to learn about economics so that they could control the Indonesian economy. They ultimately were in pursuit of those smooth white butchers of Washington's greed and state power in Indonesia. The economists of Indonesian origin who taught at CESCODE, such as Muhammad Sadly, later become the so-called technocrats and Berkeley mafia of the Suharto regime, funded by the U.S. smooth, racist white butchers of Washington. Suharto was a criminal who was charged for corruption and dismissed for smuggling as army commander. The charges were hushed up and he was sent to CESCODE in late 1959. There he met Suharto. He was involved in the formation of the doctrine of territorial warfare and the penetration of army officers into all fields of government activities, businesses, and civilian officers. As leader of this colonial shadow government within Indonesia, he became very friendly with the United States politicians. Confrontasi we described. It was a border dispute between Malaysia and Indonesia because Sukarno had found British colonial government of independent Malay, violently suppressing the leftists in Malaya, territory. It was an independent Malay. However, it was infiltrated by British special agents and intelligence who destroyed the leftist movement and maintained a right-wing military dictatorship advised for by Great Britain. As we alluded to previously, Sukarno had become aware of these British violent suppressions of Malayan leftists and was not happy with this action. He made this clear and began border skirmishes against the British at the Malayan border. The Army generals did not like this. The U.S. funded smooth butcher of Washington, agents of Indonesian army were not happy with this. They were not interested in conflict with Britain or the United States, as they were seeking to maintain Indonesia as a colonial American regime. Thus, any orders Sukarno gave to the army were secretly discarded by Yani, Nasution, and Suharto, making Sukarno's stand at the border a complete failure. This clearly indicates that the smooth white racist butchers of Washington and the army generals were totally devoid of any democratic thought and entrenched in recolonizing Indonesia for American capitalist interests. Suharto and the army generals went so far as to directly communicate with the enemy, Britain and the United States, despite being the Indonesian military. This clearly indicates a complete lack of respect for the popularly elected leader Sukarno and complete treason on the part of the army officers involved in not executing the wishes of the duly democratically elected president. Finally, it is very clear that the coup was directly arranged by CIA covert actions to paint the PKI as an anti-nationalist organization and danger to the security of the Indonesian military. Transcripts that were recorded, we read them in the book, 10 Years Military Terror in Indonesia, were recorded again and again between Johnson, McNamara, CIA, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, State Department, as well as Guy Parker of Rand Corporation, Russell Fifield, and several other people. These transcripts indicate that the CIA planted the seed for the overthrow of Sukarno. They forced the PKI into a position of fear through the army generals. The events around September 30th movement clearly revealed that the recorded transcripts of conversations between all the U.S. officials, the U.S. academic the nexus of white quacks and frauds, and the CIA and State Department, that the event was needed in Indonesia, that would be viewed by the public as an anti-nationalist event and would threaten the security of the military and justify severe repressive measures against 30 to 40% of the population, the majority of which were members of the PKI. The CIA made this event happen through the September 30th movement. The transcripts further propose that it is anticipated that an attack and murder on the army generals by the PKI was to occur in a short time. These transcripts clearly reveal the smooth white butchers of Washington intend to spark off the coup by utilizing covert actions through Sham, Colonel Untung, Letiv, Suparjo, etc., which involved Suharto and the army generals. And then once the Sukarno loyalist officers were in a vulnerable position, violently attacked the loyalists and set off the worst bloodbath in the history of mankind. Over 1.5 million people were slaughtered by the army generals of Indonesia in 6 months, and severe repression, including arbitrary imprisonment, chattel slavery, sexual slavery, disappearances, mass graves, mass starvation and famine, indescribable homelessness, and colonial high crimes were committed by the smooth white butchers of Washington through the military. This bloodbath is described as the worst organized slaughter in world history and is comparable only to Hitler's extermination of the Jews and blacks in Nazi Germany. Thus, in summary, the smooth white butchers of Washington, led by the Johnson administration, the CIA, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the U.S. military and American academic white frauds and U.S. mass media all conspired against populist leader Sukarno in the most murderous assault against a group of human beings the world has yet to know. The 32-year military dictatorship by Haj Suharto was kept secret from the world and resulted in the worst economic failure of American capitalism evident in any colonial nation. The American colonial rule did result in one thing. It made the smooth white butchers of Washington and their capitalists richer, starved the Indonesian people, forced millions of Indonesians into concentration camps and homelessness, and resulted in an economic debt by the Indonesian government well greater than any benefit it had ever received from this colonial capitalist paradigm. Essentially bankruptcy, as stated by Peter Dale Scott in Military Terror in Indonesia. The dictatorship finally ended in 1998, 32 years after it started, 50 years after the last colonial government was dissolved. The whole history is kept secret by the smooth, sadistic, detached, cruel white butchers of Washington. So basically, that's it. Actually today, after this, I'm going to actually take a little break, and then I'm going to finish the book, because tomorrow I have another book that I think it would be better to get through. So I'll finish the book. It'll be a short, maybe a 5 to 10 minute, review and overview of the book. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I will put as many notes as I can. Again, all my notes as PDF form or Google Docs forms will be on my website. That website is worldhistorylabs.com. It's not actually up yet, but it'll be up in a week. You'll be able to download this book, 10 Years Military Terror in Indonesia, as well as these are other books that I recommend purchasing: The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade, and the Mass Murder Program that shaped our world, as well as Pretext for Mass Murder, the September 30th movement, and Suharto's coup d'etat in Indonesia. So hope you enjoyed it. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.